We had a conversation when we said how surprised artists would be if they came, who had painted in the classical Northlight studio, and they came into the museum and saw all their works under tungsten. Now, whether tungsten down spots, whether they would be, whether they'd like it or not, they would at first, no doubt, be startled. It would be completely different from the way they had intended the piece and they'd seen the piece. And I think your point about a contrasting warm element, if I really want to make a scintillation between a cool element and a warm element, and I'm under blue light of daylight, I have to crank that orange up to overwhelm the blue spectrum. Under a mix of incandescent or tungsten and daylight, I have to, if I crank that orange up too much, it's way too red. So it boosts the whole red spectrum. And that's a crucial bit. The cool-warm thing, balance in any painting, is a very crucial bit. If your lighting helps to boost the warmth, or dampens the warmth of the, or either of the contrasts, you've got a very delicate balancing problem for the total expressive intent of the piece. So it's just it's an old problem, and it's made now very exacerbated by the fact that you have all these different spectrum lights, whereas at least before it was painted under daylight and it was viewed under daylight. What the old studio really wanted to do was expose it. They didn't want dome light. It's not, you didn't want the light that you got outside, where you had a 360 dome of light. You wanted the light to spill in from one side, from up or above and along the whole side. You have this giant diffuse light from one side and the top, sort of like a quarter dome of light that spilled into the room and left nice strong shadows on the other side of the object. And that was the classic studio light for a very long time. Because the subject and the canvas are in the same light, you've maximized your capacity to be faithful to what you see. You're not looking from... This is a problem outdoors, by the way, because if you paint in the sun, the direct sun on your canvas, you have a very different spectrum than if you paint in the shade and look into the sun. As a matter of fact, anytime I painted outdoors, I always had the sun beam right into my canvas if the subject I was looking at was also in the sun, so that I'd have a match. But that's an awful lot of light on your piece, so that when you take inside, it looks very dark by comparison, because everything has been pitched up. How's the word the other way? Let's see. Yes. No, it looks way darker than what you, obviously, because you brought it in from the sun. So you run into that problem. So I think what the Sargent used to do was to rig a big diffusing umbrella over his canvas, which would let the sun come through, but lower the intensity, keep the spectrum the same, but balance the degree of light, so that when you took it back into the studio, it wasn't all dark. So these problems existed all along in a subtle form. They're just now exacerbated by all these new spectrums of light, and it's a problem that dearly needs to be solved in terms of reproduction. And that's okay. But even if you make the whole painting out of dirt, that is the old classic palettes, which are made with earth colors and ash and lead for white. If you just use these completely non-tamaristic colors straight up, and you shift the spectrum on anything like that, the expressive intention of the piece is changed. I think you could make a good argument that you couldn't write a thesis about a painting without seeing it in the light that it was painted in. I think, as a matter of fact, that you mention it, I think it's hard to argue against that. You really should see it as the artist intended it. The dilemma in that the art student most often sees paintings in the gallery light. And that will not have been the light that, let's say in the case of a Monet, particularly painted in the daylight, it will not be the spectrum that he painted them on. So there is a handicap, even setting aside reproduction, even seeing the pieces in the flesh in the settings which you normally can see them in museums, you don't quite understand how the piece is built coloristically, and let's say in the case of Monet, that's exceedingly important. I copied a Monet once. A customer of ours had given a Monet to the Museum of Fine Arts, to his wife. He needed a copy of it to put back in the living room. So because he had given it to the MFA, I was allowed to paint it under special conditions at the same size in the museum. And I ran into the same problem again. So now I'm looking at that painting in the museum light. And I had to make sure that I could get my easel into the spill of the tungsten light in order to match the colors. Because if I pulled back and I was out of the spill of that light, the spectrum from the overhead skylight was too dominant and too cool, and I couldn't match my colors. Standing right next to the Monet, about 5 feet back from it, the colors on the wall and the colors on my canvas were in different enough spectrums that I was causing confusion. Now, they're supposed to be 5 feet. The rule was you're always supposed to have 5 feet or 6 feet or something between you and them. They don't want you sticking your maul stick through the Monet. So because this guy had given the Monet to the museum, that was exempted, and I pulled my painting right up next to the Monet and got it into the same spectrum of light. So that's a perfect example, and I was there able to proceed. No, but we should note, not in the light that Monet made the painting, but in a matching light, at least. So I had some shot at mimicking the colors in those spectrums. It would have been a very interesting test to take them both outdoors, because he would have used different paints. There was all sorts of different issues that would show up then. I'd love to, this whole experience has made me feel like I'd just love to drag all those sergeants out into the sunlight, not sunlight, into the daylight, and see what they really look like. I don't think there's any artist who is truly tuned in to his own piece deeply is ever really satisfied with the reproduction. The reproduction is not in the same materials, it doesn't have the same resonance, there is some subtlety about the actual piece which is not going to be reproduced. There is going to be some difference in color. What we want is that the reproduction not torture the piece, not rip apart something which is essential to the expressive goal of the piece. And there was a time before I was introduced to this process that Ted is doing, that I just wouldn't allow paintings to be reproduced. I thought so much was lost, and I'd had some done professionally. I thought so much was lost. I said, well, these are professionals. They should know what they're doing. And they're just not, I guess photography just can't, the present state of photography, even though it seems full of wonderful tools, can't capture the effects that I have in my pieces. So they should be seen in the flesh. I'm not going to even bother to reproduce them. I want somebody to stand in front of them under the proper lighting conditions and see the pieces as they are. And I still prefer that, because there are subtleties that can't be otherwise matched. But for the first time, I can put out an image and say, reproduction, and say, that gets to it. That's getting close. People have some idea what the piece really looks like, and they're not. I don't know. It's hard to speak for the other artists here. I know those who are interested in realism, any artist who I think is interested in the real subtleties of painting, is going to be interested in this issue. But there are, I can imagine, and we were talking about this earlier, some for whom this is not as intense, at least, an issue as it is for me, for who maybe use very intense palettes, and maybe they don't mind at all seeing it in a different spectrum, different things come out, and it's hard for me to understand because I am so keyed in to wanting to have the desired effect, not intellectually aware of the spectrums or any of that. I don't think that has any bearing. If he's concerned for the effect of the piece, for the expressive effect of the piece, he will note how it looks under one light or another light, and will be very keyed into that. I cannot see where an artist worth his salt says, "Oh, I don't care what the colors look like." It's sort of blowing off one of the central issues of the piece. Not to mention the tone structure. The tone structure is affected by this. You know, as you, let's say, have a very nice deep blue, black. If the light is, let's say, too warm on the piece, it will make that blue-black look less dark by association to the other colors, and that'll affect it. So even something of the tonal range of the piece is affected. This is more than anything else. I do not really understand how you can argue against that a painting ought to be reproduced in the same light that it was created. I cannot see, from a pure logical standpoint, where you can get any other stance. The thing has been lovingly made with a very spectrum-sensitive state of mind, and it is, at least for my paintings. I pay acute attention to what it looks like in different colored lights, different levels of intensity of light. I paid a lot of attention to that. How can someone who is reproducing the piece say, none of that matters? It doesn't matter what spectrum the artist painted it under. It doesn't matter all his concerns for color. All that's uninteresting or unimportant.